Hi, my name is Adam Hamilton, author of 24 Hours That Changed the World. During the next few weeks, we're going to take a journey together, focusing on what Christians believe is the most important event in human history, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. In the book, we'll take an in-depth look at the events that took place beginning with the Last Supper and ending with Christ's crucifixion, with a postscript on the resurrection. The purpose of the video is not to retrace the material in the book, but to supplement it. One important element each week will be the chance for you to visit the Holy Land. Segments of each video were filmed there in the places tradition associates with the events of the last day of Jesus' life. I'll mention here also that there's a companion to the book and study that I've prepared, a daily devotional that consists of 41 daily scripture readings and a short message to help you explore devotionally the meaning of the text. Now, each of the four Gospels tells the story of the last 24 hours of Jesus' life in slightly different ways. Our starting point is Mark's Gospel. As most scholars believe, it was the earliest of the Gospels written. But we'll explore details from the other Gospels as well. So as we begin, let's turn to Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 16, Mark's account of the Last Supper. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." So the disciples set out and went to the city and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. Now in your reading, I've noted that Luke tells us that Jesus specifically chose Peter and John for the task of preparing the meal. You'll want to consider why he chose these two disciples and how they must have felt about being asked to prepare the meal. But before you do, I'd like to take you to Jerusalem to see the traditional location of the Last Supper. Now bear in mind, as we visit the holy sites, any buildings you see were built centuries after the time of Christ. The entire city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, as Jesus had predicted, 40 years after his death. With this in mind, let's go to the upper room. This is the traditional location of the upper room. This building was built by the Crusaders more than 1,000 years after the time of Christ. It's a fascinating place, perhaps the size of the actual upper room. It's thought by some that the upper room where Jesus ate his Last Supper is the same upper room where 120 disciples were gathered on the day of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit was poured out upon them. The room would have been the guest quarters of a wealthy individual living in Jerusalem, one who was apparently a follower of Jesus. Now let's consider how this meal would have been eaten. Not long ago, I helped the congregation I pastor to understand first century dining practices and how the Last Supper was likely eaten. So take a listen.
Most of us, our picture of the Last Supper is shaped by Leonardo da Vinci, who gave us this painting. And we see Jesus sitting at the table, a table like our supper tables, with the disciples on his left and on his right, and he's preparing to share with them this meal. And so this is what we have in our mind, and we have in mind the Lord's Supper and how it went down. But I tell you, Da Vinci had it wrong. So I'd like for you to see in a fresh way how the Last Supper actually went down. All right? I have behind me a triclinium. A triclinium is a table. It's in a U shape. There are 3 segments to the table, and it's open in the center so that the servants can come and serve the people who are sitting at table. Now, the triclinium was low to the ground. It was something that you reclined at. So you actually sat on cushion or reclined on cushions as you sat at the table. Tri, 3-sided, clinium, from recline, or to recline. And so you've got this picture of a triclinium. This was what a formal dining room looked like. And when you were having a formal dinner, it was held at a triclinium or eaten at a triclinium throughout the Roman Empire and in Israel. Now, we have in our mind that Jesus sat here, right? Because this is the head of the table, of course, but not in the first century. This was not the head of the table. The head of the table was here. And one reclined at this table, no shoes on. The shoes were left at the door. It was impolite to eat with your shoes on. And so one reclined. You reclined with your left arm down, and you ate with your right hand. And as you did this, the host of the dinner sat here in this place. This was the place of honor. And then to their right and to their left were the positions of honor, the places that they reserved for those closest to them. So remember, the disciples wondered who would sit on his right hand and his left hand when he came into his glory. These were the positions of honor. Now let me remind you of a few things. It's helpful when you see this and understand this is how people ate. First of all, with the feet behind and barefoot. This helps you understand the stories. Perhaps in Luke chapter 7, when Jesus is eating at the home of Simon the Pharisee, and a prostitute comes. Do you remember this story? And she weeps at his feet while he's eating at the table. Do you see why she's weeping at his feet? Because this is the closest she could get to the supper table. When in the gospel reading last week, we found that Jesus was eating at the home of Simon the leper, and Mary, the sister of Lazarus, came and anointed his feet with oil. And in John, she anoints his feet because she can't reach his head. His head is over here, his feet is here. This begins to make sense to us. When Jesus went to wash the disciples' feet, they would have turned around, and he would have washed their feet. So this is how they would have eaten this meal. Now, let me remind you as I continue to sit here that John's gospel tells us that Jesus says, one of you will betray me. And as he says this, Peter sort of whispers or speaks across the table to John, who's sitting next to Jesus, and says, ask him who it is who's going to betray him. And the gospel writer John tells us that he, John, leaned against Jesus' breast to ask the question. Do you understand how that happened now? He's leaning against Jesus, and he's saying, Master, which one will betray you? That tells us that John is sitting here in one of the honored positions. Now listen to Jesus' response. The one that I dip the sop with will betray me. Who's he going to dip the sop with? The person on his left. Who's sitting in the other honored position? Judas Iscariot.
Having seen the place in Jerusalem where Christians remember the Last Supper, and having understood how the meal would have been eaten, let's consider the meaning of this meal. This was a Passover Seder they were eating. The Passover Seder was celebrated once a year, and it's a festive occasion when the Jewish people remember their story. The meal takes them back more than 3,000 years ago to a time when God delivered their forebears from slavery in Egypt. Listen as my friend Rabbi Amy Katz describes the meaning of the Passover Seder.
It's the time that we remember. We cried out to God when we were slaves. God heard our cry, and God took us out of Egypt. Right? So that's a pretty big story to remember. If you think like on a personal level, if anything ever bad, if you were ever in a lousy situation or you were stuck and somebody saved you, think of how significant that moment was to you. For the Jewish people, we were slaves. And the book of Exodus says, God heard us cry out and God took us out of Egypt. So that's a big story for us. Plus, it's the birth of us as a people. The purpose is to make this story accessible to everyone who's at the table in any way that you can, because they got to get it, because it's our most important story, right? It's our defining story of how we were born as a people. The premise of the Seder, it's really a significant line that it is often and traditionally it's sung at the Seder, and it's what the whole evening is about. It comes from the Mishnah, and it says, in every generation, a person should see him or herself as if he or she were slaves in Egypt. You start out as a slave, and at the end of the night, you were free. It's a meal filled with rituals. I mean, every aspect of it is filled with ritual, from the food that you eat to how you eat it to how you sit. There's a whole order of things that you're supposed to do, and there's a book called a Haggadah that you read through. What's the purpose of it? The word Haggadah means telling. It's the telling of the story of when we were slaves and we cried out and God heard us cry and God took us out of Egypt. You know, a good Seder includes great food, it includes great singing, it includes great discussion. At my house, you figure we're going to start around 7 and we'll be done by around midnight to 12:15. A lot of it is really about the discussion of what happened and understanding not just what happened, but how we've understood what's happened and how we've told the story over the years. The book of Exodus commands us that you should eat matzah, you should eat the bitter herb, and you should eat the lamb. The other part of the meal that I'm sure that Jesus had, that was in place in Jesus' time, was these 4 cups of wine that were a part of the Seder. And the 4 cups of wine remind us of the 4 promises that God made to the Israelites that God would redeem us.
As you heard Rabbi Katz speak about the Passover Seder, in what ways is the Passover Seder for the Jewish people like our Holy Communion as Christians? Now, the meal was a way for the Jewish people to reenact and remember, to bring into the present what God had done to save them in the past. They would remember their defining story and give thanks for this salvation. They would remember that they once were slaves, but now they were free. Jesus transforms this meal, no longer about God's deliverance from slavery to the Egyptians, but now the meal would become a reminder of his presence with his disciples and his suffering and death. Paul calls it a sharing in or participation in his death until he returns. By means of this holy meal, we remember that we once were slaves to sin and death, but now we've been saved from sin and death and given new life. By means of this meal, Christians recall Christ's death. The act of receiving the meal is a way of saying, I've decided to follow Jesus. And in eating the bread and drinking the wine, we say, Lord, come and dwell in me and forgive me and make me yours. The disciples would never forget this holy meal. Each time they broke bread together, they remembered it, and they remembered him. When they gathered for worship, they shared in a meal, and as they did, they felt his presence in the breaking of the bread and the drinking from the cup. For this reason, the meal was both sacred and joyful for them, as it still is for us today.